The needle on the signal analyzer did not move. For 6 hours it had been a flat green line, a dead pulse stretching across the monitor in the back of a nondescript white van. The air inside was stifling, smelling of stale tobacco, warm electronics, and the nervous sweat of 3 men who had forgotten what it meant to sleep. They were parked 3 blocks away from a middle-class row house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín, but they could have been on the moon. The windows were tinted black. The engine was off. They sat in a silence so heavy it felt like pressure building behind the ears. Rain began to fall. Not a storm, just the relentless gray drizzle that turns the streets of the Aburra Valley into slick, reflective mirrors. The sound of the drops hitting the metal roof of the van was deafening in the quiet. Tap, 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 like a clock counting down. The man in the passenger seat adjusted his headphones. He pressed them tighter against his skull, closing his eyes, trying to filter out the rain, trying to filter out the sound of his own heartbeat. He was listening for a ghost. He was hunting a frequency in a city of 3 million noises. Then it happened. The green line jumped. It wasn't a spike, it was a tremor, a jagged elevation in the static. The technician's eyes snapped open. He didn't shout. He didn't breathe. He reached out a trembling hand and turned a small dial, narrowing the bandwidth, isolating the anomaly. Through the headphones came the sound. It was faint, buried under layers of atmospheric interference and the hum of the city grid, but it was there. A voice. It was heavy, tired, and distinctively Paisa. It was a voice that had ordered the bombing of airplanes. It was a voice that had negotiated with presidents. It was a voice that once had been the loudest thing in Colombia, now reduced to a whisper on a radio wave. The technician looked at the officer beside him. He didn't say a word, he just nodded. The officer picked up his radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. He hesitated. This was the terrifying threshold. If they were wrong, they would raid an innocent home and the ghost would vanish into the jungle again, perhaps forever. If they were right, they were about to initiate the most violent collision in the history of criminal warfare. The voice on the monitor grew louder. He was talking about a hotel. He was talking about the press. He was agitated. He was staying on the line. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The rule was never stay on for more than 2 minutes. The ghost knew the rule. He had written the rule. But the seconds kept ticking. The green line kept dancing. The officer in the van pressed the button. Target acquired, he whispered. Los Olivos, closing the net. The static hissed. The rain drummed. And 3 blocks away, a man in a second-floor bedroom sat on a bed, holding a phone, unaware that the invisible waves carrying his voice were actually drawing a map to his grave. If you're drawn to the untold stories of power, betrayal, and men who ruled through fear rather than noise, you're already in the right place. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books will tell you that the search for Escobar was a military operation. They will show you photos of soldiers in jungle fatigues, helicopters sweeping over the rainforests, and politicians shaking hands in Bogotá. But those were the images they wanted you to see. Those were the theatrics. The truth is that the war for Medellín was not fought with bullets, at least not in the end. It was fought with mathematics. It was fought with radio frequencies and the patience of men who had to become machines to catch a monster. For months, the narrative has been that Escobar was cornered by his enemies, by the vigilante group Los Pepes, by the Cali cartel. And while the wolves were certainly circling, the fatal blow came from something far colder. It came from a shift in technology that the king of cocaine simply did not understand. He believed he was fighting a war of territory. He didn't realize he was fighting a war of information. The breakdown of the most sophisticated criminal empire in history did not begin with an explosion. It began with silence. By late 1993, the man who had once offered to pay off Colombia's national debt was living like a rat. The haciendas were gone. The zoo was gone. The private army was dead or in prison. He was moving between safe houses every 48 hours, carried in the trunks of taxicabs, eating cold food and staring at the same four walls. Isolation is a poison. It works slowly. It eats away at judgment. It corrodes the instinct for survival. For a man defined by his control over others, the loss of contact was worse than death. He needed to hear voices. He needed to give orders. He needed to know that he still mattered. And this psychological fracture is what the search block, the Special Police Unit Task Force, was banking on. They stopped chasing his body and started chasing his mind. They knew he was alone. They knew he was separated from his wife and children, who were holed up in the Hotel Tequendama in Bogotá under heavy government guard. They knew that his love for his family was the only thing stronger than his paranoia. So they squeezed. They blocked the family's asylum requests. They leaked stories to the press. They made sure that every time Pablo turned on the television, he saw his family in danger. They were baiting him. They were begging him to pick up the phone. The man in the safe house in Los Olivos was unrecognizable. He was overweight, bearded, and sluggish. He spent his days lying on a cheap mattress, reading newspapers that declared his era over. The house was hot. The curtains were always drawn. The air was thick with the smell of anxiety. He had one bodyguard with him, a loyalist named Limon, who watched his boss with a mixture of reverence and terror. Pablo would pace the room. He would look at the radio phone on the nightstand. It was a brick of black plastic, his lifeline to the world. He knew the Americans had sent sophisticated equipment to Colombia. He knew about the surveillance planes flying high-altitude loops over the city. He warned his subordinates constantly, "The phone is death. The phone is death." But silence is torture. On December 1st, 1993, he turned 44. It was a grim celebration. There was a cake, some wine, and a heavy, suffocating mood. He wanted to speak to his son, Juan Pablo. He wanted to speak to his daughter, Manuela. He picked up the phone. The search block was waiting. They weren't just listening anymore. They were measuring. They were using a technique called radio direction finding. It required 3 mobile units, vans packed with equipment provided by American intelligence agencies, moving in a coordinated dance through the city streets. As soon as the target transmitted, the vans would stop. They would rotate directional antennas until the signal strength peaked. They would draw a line on a map. Where the 3 lines intersected, that was the target. It seems simple. In practice, it was a nightmare. The hills of Medellín bounced radio signals like echoes in a canyon. A signal coming from the north might actually be reflecting off a building in the south. The search block had chased ghosts for months, kicking down doors only to find empty rooms and cooling coffee cups. But on December 2nd, the dynamic changed. Pablo woke up late. He was agitated. He had seen a magazine cover that insulted his family. His ego, battered and bruised, flared up one last time. He forgot the discipline that had kept him alive for a decade. He forgot the 2-minute rule. He called the Hotel Tequendama. He started talking. In the white van, the technician saw the signal stabilize. It wasn't bouncing. It was strong. It was direct. "He's not moving," the technician said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "He's stationary." The vans maneuvered, one to the north of the stadium, one to the west, one closing in from the south. They were triangulation points in a geometry of death. Inside the bedroom, Pablo was ranting. He was telling his son how he would deal with the journalists. He was posturing. For a moment he felt powerful again. He was the patron. He was the voice that commanded respect. He lost track of time. 3 minutes, 4 minutes. This was the moment everything began to crack. The lines on the map in the command center converged. They didn't cross over a neighborhood. They didn't cross over a block. They crossed over a specific house, a 2-story brick row house with an attached garage. Colonel Martinez, the head of the search block, looked at the map. He had hunted this man for years. He had seen his colleagues killed, his family threatened, his reputation dragged through the mud. He looked at the X on the map. He said, "Go."
He didn't scream it. He didn't slam the table. It was a quiet command, the release of a breath held for too long. The vans were already close. Troops from the elite unit poured out. They didn't use sirens. They didn't flash lights. They moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of men who have rehearsed this moment in their nightmares. In the room, Pablo paused. He stopped mid-sentence. "Wait," he said to his son, "I'll call you back." He hung up. Why did he hang up? Did he hear a car door slam? Did he sense the shift in the atmosphere? Or was it just the animal instinct, the sixth sense that had saved him from 100 ambushes before? He stood up. He walked to the window and peered through the slit in the curtains. He saw a man on the street below. The man was looking at a map. Then the man looked up, straight at the window. Their eyes didn't meet. The glass was dark, but the connection was made. The hunter had found the prey. "Limon," Pablo whispered. The bodyguard jumped up. "They are here." There was no time to pack, no time to burn documents, no time for the escape plans that had been drafted and redrafted. There was only the window. The front door of the house crashed open. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the stairwell. Boots pounded on the tile. "Search block! Search block!" The shouting was tactical. It was designed to induce panic, to freeze the target. But Pablo didn't freeze. He moved with a speed that belied his weight. He grabbed his Sig Sauer pistol. He ran to the back window that opened onto the clay-tiled roof. Limon went first. He scrambled out, sliding on the wet tiles, dropping into the alleyway below to engage the police. He fired. He was cut down instantly. A volley of return fire silenced him before he hit the ground. Pablo stepped out onto the roof. The rain was cold on his face. He was barefoot. He was wearing blue jeans and a blue t-shirt that was too tight. He looked nothing like a king. He looked like a frightened, middle-aged man trying to escape a fire. He looked to the left. Soldiers were blocking the alley. He looked to the right. Police were on the neighboring roofs. He was surrounded. The triangulation was perfect. He raised his gun. He fired blindly, not aiming, just making noise. It was a refusal to go quietly. The response was overwhelming. The air around him turned into a storm of lead. Bullets chipped the tiles, sending sharp fragments of red clay flying into his legs. He ran toward the edge of the roof, aiming for the back of the house, hoping for a miracle.
Then the noise stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was an abrupt, violent cessation of consciousness. A bullet entered behind his right ear. It severed the brainstem. It was the kill shot. The lights went out. He crumpled. His knees gave way and he fell forward, his face slapping against the wet, red tiles. His gun skittered away from his hand. The most wanted man in the world lay dead on a roof in a quiet neighborhood while the rain washed the blood down into the gutter. For a moment there was total silence. The soldiers below waited. They didn't believe it. They had seen him escape the impossible before. They waited for him to stand up. They waited for a grenade. But the body was still. "Viva Colombia!" The shout came from a radio, then another, then a cheer rose up from the street. It was a primal, savage sound, the release of years of fear. The soldiers climbed onto the roof. They stood over the body. They didn't treat it with the solemnity of a fallen adversary. They treated it like a trophy. They smiled. They grabbed his limp arms and posed for photographs. They grinned, holding their rifles in the air, standing next to the bloody, barefoot corpse of the man who had terrified a nation. That image, the bloated body, the smiling police, the gray sky, became the defining symbol of the end. It was printed on the front page of every newspaper in the world. It was proof. But proof of what? The death of Pablo Escobar did not stop the flow of cocaine. It did not end the violence in Colombia. In fact, the year after his death, exports increased. The Cali cartel, who had helped hunt him down, simply absorbed his market share. The business became quieter, more corporate, more efficient. Escobar was a dinosaur. He was a bandit king in an era that was moving toward multinational crime syndicates. He was loud, he was visible, and that was his sin. The tracking of Pablo Escobar was not a victory of justice over evil. It was a victory of system over individual. It proved that in the modern world, you cannot hide from the grid. You cannot fight the frequency. No matter how much money you have, no matter how many soldiers you command, if you pick up the phone, you are dead. The legend of Escobar grew in the silence that followed. The poor of Medellín mourned him. They ignored the bombings and the assassinations and remembered the houses he built. To them, he was a victim of the state. To the state, he was a monster slain by heroes. But the truth lies somewhere in the static between those two stories. He was a man who miscalculated. He believed that his will was stronger than the changing world. He believed that loyalty could defeat technology. He was wrong.
In his final moments on that roof, he wasn't thinking about his empire. He wasn't thinking about his billions buried in the ground. He was thinking about a phone call he would never finish. He was thinking about a voice on the other end of the line that he had jeopardized because he couldn't bear the silence. We tell ourselves that we are in control of our lives. We build walls, we lock doors, we curate our legacies. But we are all just signals in the air, waiting to be triangulated. We are all just one mistake away from the roof. Power is not about who has the gun. Power is about who controls the silence. And on that rainy afternoon in December, the silence finally won. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.